Welcome, everybody, to the Serpentine Galleries this evening. Can you all hear me clearly? It's fine. I don't need to project too much then. Okay. Hopefully, all of you have had an opportunity to see the exhibition we're in this evening. Ian Cheng, Bob. On the other side, we have Sandra Perry. Forgive me, Sandra. Typhoon coming on. The exhibitions will be running till the end of May. It's my great pleasure to introduce on stage Ian Cheng and Nora Khan. Ian Cheng's exhibition. Nora has actually contributed to both catalogues for both exhibitions and has come here this evening to join us. And this evening we're going to be talking kind of around the subjects of AI, simulation, and specifically kind of zoning in on Ian's work. To open proceedings, Nora's going to present a short talk, and then we're going to conversation, and then we're going to Q&A. And hopefully we're going to take a kind of generous approach to talking through some of the subject matter that's in play and some of the kind of technical aspects that bring this work together. I haven't introduced myself. I'm Ben Vickers. I'm the CTO at the Serpentine Galleries, and I co-curated this exhibition with Rebecca Lewin. And it's before I begin, there's a couple of things that I should say about the exhibition. So the exhibition is actually composed in two parts. So on the 23rd of April, this exhibition with Bob will actually flip into emissaries, and the exhibition has been designed in such a way that it can accommodate both the Bob's works, but also the Emissaries trilogy. So in this room, we have the second episode, Emissary Forks of Perfection. In the first room, we have Emissary and the Squad of Gods, the first episode. And then in the other gallery, we will have Emissary Sunsets itself. And to mark that occasion, we've produced, as part of the exhibition, and with Ian, a book on the subject of worldings, which is a guide both to worlding and also emissaries, which we'll probably talk in some depth about in this discussion. Other things that I should mention is that on Sunday evening, there will be, or Sunday daytime, there will be an opportunity actually to come on site to the Serpentine Galleries and have a portrait painted of yourself alongside Bob. So I really encourage everybody to come along to that. And just before we go into the conversation, it's important that I thank everybody that made this possible, because this was a fairly colossal effort to bring this exhibition together. So I'd like to thank Vion, our innovation partners on this exhibition, in particular Christopher Schleifer. I'd like to thank Samsung as a supporter. And we are deeply indebted to Maurice Massiano, Gladstone Gallery, Pilar Correas, who's with us this evening, Jed Valentis, Eleanor and Bobby Kerr, and the Future Contemporaries Emerging Artists Fund. So to kick us off, Nora, would you like to open?
Yes. Thank you, Ben. And I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you all for coming. And thank you to the Serpentine team for having me, and Hans for inviting me. And of course, so many congrats to Ian and Sandra Perry on their two seriously beautiful shows. And it's just been an incredible challenge to write about the two of them for the catalogs, and in the process try to describe and reaffirm why their practices are so important for us to engage with and why their perspectives are so singular. So 3 years ago, I first played Bad Corgi in a snowstorm in Boston, and everyone was shut up in their house for days. And I was stuck with this infuriating Shiba Inu dog in this game of herding sheep that you can never win. And one of my favorite responses to Bad Corgi on the user response page is, quote, "I find this app very frustrating, but I now find life a lot less frustrating by comparison." And even after years of reviewing and writing about design of emotion in games and tech interfaces and art, Bad Corgi was instantly recognizable to me as something completely different. And I had this distinct sense of Ian's use of a simulation to not smooth, but to also challenge a viewer and demand more cognitively from them. And the Bad Corgi app set out to make you aware of your emerging and evolving relationship to a different kind of intelligence on the horizon. And it was a hint at the tenets in his work to come. And after playing Bad Corgi, I invited Ian and Sandra to the New Museum, where I work at Rhizome as an editor, for a discussion on AI and art. And then we met up at the Whitney to talk with Christiana Paul about emissaries. So in that 4-year span from Bad Corgi to now, so much has happened, and I wanted to talk a bit about why critics and thinkers keep returning to, and I think will keep returning to Ian's work in the future, and what's involved in the challenge at the core of it. So for one, Bad Corgi and Emissaries and Bob all intentionally produce a kind of friction that we need more of in our relationship to technology. And most corporate design of technology and AI in games and graphically designed films insist on immersion and smoothness, that we be unaware of the intention behind code. It's smooth, it's effortless, and you barely notice your phone and the devices that you use. This is the overriding imperative of technology now and design, to be calm and also to calm you in turn. But not only did Bad Corgi refuse a kind of easy language and easy graphical smoothness, it had its own naive life. Ian modeled the illusion of smoothness and then allowed the life of this creature to disrupt that smoothness. And so it pushed back and seemed to say that this is what a system can do. It had its own integrity. It could upset you and it could shape you in turn. And so the relationship with this artificial dog demanded attention and care and feeling. So last night at the opening, I sat in the next room to listen to Bob sort of hum and chirp and coo. And I couldn't help but overhear some of the conversation going on around me, some guests asking each other, what really is this and what is happening? And then this couple did something really remarkable and lovely, which was they sat through to talk about what they thought was happening, what they believed was happening. And they started to come up with a little story, which was pretty good, between them about the Bobs and the relationship between the Bobs. And then they sort of fell quiet and then they left. And so I kept returning today to that moment of confrontation with this strange being on a screen. And I watched Bob smile at me and then shut down a few times, and the feeling of being shut down lingered. I thought of people and friendships that have faded over the years, unexpected breaks in relationships, and how people who are familiar can become strange almost instantly. And I thought about the earliest world, the landscape in which an early mind confronts another, and all those memories and senses of possibility and time frames and imaginaries collapsed one on top of another in this confrontation, and which is what poetry does for us in some of the best fiction. It's important to note that a simulation is fundamentally different from other fictional worlds, a simulation that generates itself, which has seeming indifference to us. A simulation generates completely different parameters for what beliefs can be held by virtue of its complexity. It changes our sense of frame, our sense of time and scale and speed, and our sense of what a character is and can be. Predictability is thrown out the window. Meaning becomes modular and open to change and constantly in flux. And so the representation is of flux, and in watching, we're asked to catch up with these beings and move more quickly and come up with new language and shift with it in what kind of mental dance in which language and fiction and narrative struggle to catch up with what's on the screen. So when I look at the facial expressions of the emissaries out in the lobby and the Bobs, I'm aware of this meaning that I'm projecting onto them. And similarly, in our encounters with people, with new people, we already project meaning, and we misinterpret, and we fumble and miscommunicate constantly. But we've evolved to become very good at expressing clearly and reading other faces fairly well. And in contrast, when I was looking at Bob yesterday, their face is fairly ominous and full of ciphers, and I'm not really sure that I'm interpreting it well. So I just have to move forward with the impression that I make on faith. And much as we learn as to trust people by their eyes and their smiles and body language, we learn to compress the visual data of Bob moving. And somewhere between these projections and our blind spots and its gestures, we construct a kind of objective reality from which we can move forward. So the messiness of this confrontation is something I wanted to linger on. We work through our encounters with other species, dogs, non-human intelligences in the same way. And we try to figure out their obscure intentions with the same tools. And without realizing it as such, we practice a kind of mental flexibility in this relationship and trying to see like machines and try and orient and frame the Bobs as we're looking at it. And this creates a kind of brutal, because it's forced, and ecstatic intimacy with simulations. And while the narrative is beautiful and lends the whole Emissary series and the Bob series a kind of world building and world incoherence, I would say that it's not totally essential for relating to the works. With Emissaries and with Bob, I don't think the story is prescriptive either, and more of a gesture for you as a viewer to make your own worlds out of the encounter. The work creates a situation in which the viewers turn back to think on their thinking and think on their storytelling in their heads, which is what we do constantly. So onto the name, Bob, Bag of Beliefs, is from Ursula K. Le Guin's Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, in which she writes about how the hero narrative of conquest and domination that shapes society and technology can be reversed, man heading out into the West or into space with a goal of growth and triumph and endless happiness. She suggests that this narrative can be abandoned because your beliefs are actually provisional and you can replace them. She writes that, quote, the natural, proper, fitting shape of the novel might be that of a sack or a bag. A book holds words, words hold things, and words bear meanings. So a novel is a medicinal bundle holding things in a particular powerful relationship to one another and to us. So if we think of our beliefs as held in a sack and ourselves as bags of belief moving around, we might start to create stories outside of the hero narrative, stories with far fewer triumphs, this is Le Guin again, than snares and delusions, full of spaceships that get stuck, missions that fail, and people who don't understand. So I see the Bob as a kind of mirror of the world that we're in now, in which we do need to carry narratives about technology to give meaning to it. But we also need to be able to discard tired narratives and stories and create anew in order to survive. So when looking at these simulations, what kind of stories would you tell about a world with no end? As most stories need limits, and poetry needs limits too, and we impose limits to make sense and meaning. But the limits of a story change through simulation. So what does it do to us to think of an artificial life going on forever? The prospect of unending change. And what would happen to your sense of responsibility and care and commitment to other people? And the urgency we apply to our lives and work might simply dissipate. I would say the simulation offers a space for this kind of defamiliarization in which we understand ourselves as just one kind of intelligence, which is a terrifying prospect at first for humanists, or people still holding on to the idea that we're the center of the universe. But as guests in this world, we're asked to observe and be quiet and relinquish control and accept uncertainty, and accept that there might be no one explanation. And so much opens up in that, which is what's most exciting about these works for me, which is that we become less sure of the knowledge that we think that we hold. And as we try to wrap our minds around the Bobs, as they refuse us, the limits for language recede, like along an asymptote. In the gallery text, it says Bob may engage in activities, quote, powerful enough to change its mind and reshape its body. And this open attitude towards transformation, that your beliefs today may not be the same beliefs you have tomorrow, is the key to being cognitively flexible and equipped. And this is the story of our time, in which your cognition is changing from moment to moment as our lives become more and more married to technology. So we have algorithms that channel traffic lights and high-frequency trading and the flow of capital, which we can talk about. And on a more local level, algorithms channel who gets jobs, who's thought of as criminal and unemployable, who stays without opportunity, and which status quo is affirmed. And a lot of AI can feel profoundly stupid, to use Hito Steyrl's phrasing, and inhuman at times. It's designed with the imperative to describe reality through a really banal and limited set of norms. So the interaction we have with Bob is a kind of perfect microcosm of the relationship we have to AI and tech now. As we're bound within and shaped by systems, we can also reformat and readjust and reform our relationship to them. And we must, if we're really looking closely, engage on some level with the messiness and the habits and the complexity of others, even if the response is at first to turn away from it. Bob is the moment of emerging AI turning to look right back at you, asking you to look beyond the figure, beyond the image, to engage with the logics or illogic of a system. Bob asks you to be aware of systems that organize nearly every aspect of your life, your ideology, your faith, your ideas of good and success and bad and evil, and examine them. And Bob also asks you to consider the others in the room watching Bob, to pay closer attention to detail, to subtle changes in affect and expression, comfort and discomfort, and their relationship to this life form. So the works in this space show a really deep respect for unknowability, and for how our minds constantly, obsessively try to parse the unknowable, and what we, human intelligence, are able to do. And this would make, at end, I'd claim, Ian's work deeply humanist, as we're oriented towards systems in order to, I think, challenge them. and understand how it may attempt to format, predict, and limit our own senses of possibility. And because these systems are messy and not smooth and frustrating, we're reoriented to a broader sense of relating. People with things, people in relationship to the built systems that they are in, and people relating to each other within the system. And in that reorientation, that new frame of intelligences relating to one another, I think we can think about the different kinds of stories we want to tell. And this is what good or ethical engineering could afford us when driven by a poetic and slower pace. And we can think about future systems we want to design and live in, and the values or ideas we want to drive them, and the better and more interesting open relating we want to emerge from those systems. And then we can build them. So thank you for listening. I'm going to turn it over to Ben.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We didn't really have a conversation about this talk necessarily, but it's very interesting, particularly in respect to the book, the number of common reference points that are kind of turned over and over. And I guess when we were talking about this talk and thinking about what would make sense as a kind of starting point, I think something that's quite important is that we often say many of these kind of words like simulation, AI, artificial general intelligence, blockchain, any of these kind of terms that are referred to kind of repeatedly as if we necessarily know what those things mean, and I guess whether we've come to a kind of conclusion within society about what those things mean and what the implications of them are. And so by way of a starting point, I think that it makes a lot of sense for us, whilst we will work into speaking about this specific work, a kind of logical starting point for this conversation, and I guess a point of, kind of turning in your work, Ian, is the adoption of the simulation as a form for producing a work, which is ostensibly the bag. And so I thought it might make sense that we just say, what is a simulation?
Sure.
And how is one constructed, and what are they used for?
The easiest way to say it is, I think a simulation for me, when I first had the idea, I had been making animated videos for a couple of years, and I became very frustrated with my own sense of perfectionism. I think most artists feel this way. You feel like you can perfect a work endlessly, and especially in the space of animation, you can perfect all the way down to a millisecond, all the way down to a finger gesture. And I really wanted to escape myself in a way. And I thought, what if I could make the same kind of animation more like a video game? And what if that video game could just play itself? And this sort of led to the idea of the simulation. And it also led to the idea of me kind of relieving myself of being a perfectionist. Now I don't have to perfect every animation because animation can animate itself. I now, in a way, have come to become a perfectionist of systems. And part of being a perfectionist of systems is very strange because the system's sort of abstract, and I want to fall in love with systems, and that's something that's really hard to fall in love with. And so I was very interested and reminded of my own childhood experience with games like SimCity or The Sims, where Will Wright, who created these games, managed to make you fall in love with abstract systems like city management, or The Sims, which feels like a prototype of your own Real Housewives of Orange County, and you could just fall in love with this little mini world. You didn't have to take a particular perspective, which is what we're so used to in narratives and in films. You could kind of look from a bird's eye view and still fall in love with this thing. And that's really where the interest in simulations came from.
And I think, it's kind of interesting that the figure of the simulation has become something that's quite prevalent within society. That we were talking earlier, or not necessarily within society, but a kind of collective consciousness of, when we were talking earlier about this notion of kind of portal art, and the reference of the Matrix as being like a kind of breakthrough moment. And if you were particularly interested in these moments, that you would potentially read Baudrillard and simulation theory and things like this, that now on reflection feel almost like a diagram of the present moment. And I guess I was also, in reading your text today, Nora, I was interested in the way in which you reframe the simulation in respect to kind of like this here now, that within our devices, within all of the decisions that we've made on a daily basis is not the kind of in the kind of Elon Musk way of like the belief that we live in a simulation, but rather the simulation is already constructed around us because there are these kind of algorithms that are shaping every decision that's made, the infrastructure, the logistics, and everything that happens on a daily basis. And I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit and what you're trying to maybe unpick within that.
I think a lot of the artists that I work with who work with emerging AI and with simulation design, either whether they came from a gaming background or engineering or they came from the arts, are starting to like unpack what it means to think in terms of a simulation, and which is actually something that we all have a similar background of like playing games from when we were very little. And so that's something that you intuitively understand, like your mind is shaped by gameplay, your mind is shaped by like working within a world and a system, and then that thinking is taken out into the world. And so you find this in a lot of tech design in Silicon Valley, that the XYZ plane and this blank model is what a lot of social engineering is based on. It's this idea of a body without politics or a body without history, and that you can restart and reformat, and that everyone is coming to this XYZ plane on the same level without any past and also carving out with no future too. It's a kind of fantasy that comes from techno-utopian kind of ideas. So understanding what a simulation makes you think as, and like how people are thinking of bodies within space, and how that is then going into social engineering is like crucial. I think artists really help us unstitch that and be able to see what is actually designed to be hidden and put and fade into the background and the fabric of your life. So, John Seely Brown, who ran Xerox PARC, like the coming age of comm technology was written in like 1994. And the idea is that simulations will drive how we redefine systems, and that's so like society can be re-engineered in that way. So this is like embedded in like global capital now, in everything that we do.
There's a kind of weird thing that happens when you mention gaming in the context of this, and particularly around the subject of speaking about simulation, because it's suddenly like, for me, it kind of like unlocks something. And in the context of speaking about simulation, you suddenly enter this weird space where you become when you're aware of these kinds of systems, you become very conscientious that this is not the kind of, we're living in a simulation, but the kind of, I guess like the performed roles of this kind of stage setup, having a conversation within the context of the art world with a set of individuals and the kinds of character traits, archetypes, roles, everything that's being performed in this space in order to cohere to a certain set of kind of ideologies, performance, history, etc. But gaming is weird because it suddenly unlocks that space, and it suddenly allows you to have the opportunity to talk about something that's slightly different, that I think that we share in common. I don't know if you really want to go there in terms of what you come to this through gaming, but you don't necessarily talk about gaming in respect to your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of a game, when you think of a game, you think of rules, right? Rules really structure a game. And this thought that, not that we're living in a simulation, but that our lives are very much structured by games that are artificial, is something as basic as thinking about the fact that we live in a lawful society, right? The laws are the original algorithm for a particular country. Your citizenship is a particular fixed rule. Often I get this question about the simulations, like, what have you pre-designed? And as if that question is to say that things are very deterministic. And I would say they're deterministic only insofar as the fact that, like, what constitutes citizenship, what constitutes the law, and ways in which those program us restricts our sense of agency, and I don't think they necessarily do. And so in my simulations often, there are starting parameters, there are kind of artistic decisions that I've hard-coded, but within that space, there's like an opportunity for very, 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 very basic agency. I'm very interested in this aspect. And I'm very interested in this book that's really inspired me. It's called Games People Play by Eric Berne. He was a psychiatrist who had this idea that after seeing about 50,000 patients, that everyone, starting from childhood onward, develops basically three people inside of them. There's like a child, there's a parent figure, and there's an adult. And the child is like the kind of person inside of you who's governed by a certain set of rules where they're allowed to be playful and spontaneous and creative. But the exchange of that is that they expect a parent to kind of nurture them. So when they need water, like someone has to go fetch it for them because they're fundamentally helpless. There's always that person inside of you. Once you become an adult, you don't stop being a child. The child's still in you. And then there's the idea of the parent who is the kind of authority figure who doesn't want to think about anything. They just want to tell you how things are. And for that reason, it's very energetically efficient. Like, I have a pet corgi, and when he misbehaves, there's a certain threshold where I just can't, tolerate his, spontaneous childlike behavior. I just say, you sit, or like we put him in a little room sometimes, and he has to just have a little timeout. And this is the parent mindset who's trying to be energy efficient because you can't think about everything consciously. We can't have a panel discussion about every little gesture and decision in life. And so this parent is a kind of person who emerges in that moment to deal with the situations. And finally, there's the adult, which is like, hopefully, ideally, the thing that we're able to do most often, which is, you confront a new problem and you actually just face the problem. But more often than not, we reduce ourselves to either a child or a parent, and within those, there's a set of rules that then don't really let you fully explore a problem, because exploring a problem, especially an unknown problem, is extremely painful. You'd much rather be a child because you remember being a child and things were like really not painful, like at least hopefully for most children. And for a parent, they're not painful because you just know what to do. You just know you got to do it this way. It's like when a cab driver goes the wrong way, you just know you got to take this highway. And you just say that to them. But hopefully, with the right kind of infrastructure and systems, we can, maybe the adult can emerge more often than not.
And in terms of like the development of simulations as something that you look back on yourself and producing them and thinking about how constructs or rule sets are operating within this environment, and then producing a simulation, how much of a kind of feedback loop is there between those two things?
Wait, which two things?
If we take specifically the example of like your pet, which is a corgi, which you acquired during working on Bad Corgi.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of evident feedback loop there in terms of, and it's not clear what that means as to whether you needed the corgi in order to complete the game, or you needed or vice versa. But how those things, it's radically different for you because you're working with the design of systems in reflection to systems that are operating all around us, which creates like a very high level of agency for you as an individual. And that can be seen as like, in the simple case of just being able to have a different kind of relationship with your pet, but also in respect to the way in which you operate in the world and how these systems go on to affect other systems. So if you think about this as a simulation running within the Serpentine space, it's operating within the art world's rules and context. But I guess I'm interested in like on a very personal level of like when you're working with simulations, how much of a coherent feedback loop is there between those two things? Do you learn from your simulations?
Oh, I can speak about Bob, which started as a simulation trying to delve more deeply into AI, and in making Bob and going really into trying to figure out the models of mind that Bob operates on, I realized and I learned to really appreciate Bob's body. I had to figure out how Bob's body looked. I had to figure out how Bob's body grew, the morphology of Bob, in order for the body to be as expressive as I wanted its mind to be. Because at the end of the day, we're looking at Bob from the outside in, and really needed Bob to express as much inner state as it contained. And in order to do that, I realized the AI couldn't be worked upon in isolation. We think of AI as something that kind of like lives in the cloud or is like abstractly mathematically engineered, but I realized the moment where we really think something's going to be sentient and powered by AI is probably something like the self-driving car, which has this obvious and clear physicality and body. And I saw a self-driving car when I was in Pittsburgh, where the Uber was testing real self-driving cars on the road, and you just see their acceleration and deceleration is so different from how a human would step on the pedal. And you feel their alienness, and it was super beautiful and really strange, but I felt its agency because it had a body. And I really discovered this in making Bob, that I needed to work on Bob's body actually first, not his AI.
that's probably a good opportunity to, as we said before, of like differentiating and maybe defining some of the terms. And if we're moving from simulation to AI, there's kind of specifics of what's at play in the work that you produce, because more so than simulation, artificial intelligence is something, it's just a term we refer to without necessarily referring to the different categories of AI, its history, and its kind of role within society. So I think it would be very helpful if you explained a little bit about the kind of AI that this work utilizes and that you've developed in comparison to the kind of AI that we're seeing kind of in the news stories that appear in the papers every day at the moment.
Sure. I mean, in AI, there's historically, I think, been basically two camps, and we're seeing one camp being very popular right now, which is deep learning or machine learning, which kind of mimics the kind of neurological structure of a bunch of nerves hooked up together, and you feed it a lot of data, and over time it statistically remaps that data into a kind of output label. So you give Google image search 1,000 images of dogs, and then now you can get a properly labeled dog. And I think that mimics the kind of intelligence that our sensory organs have, like our eyes, where I look at this water bottle and I can clearly define it. I can see instantly. It requires no thinking to see its shape. I don't see it particle for particle or molecule for molecule. And this kind of inference of what its shape is sort of like at the heart of, I think, deep learning, which is this sort of statistical recognition machine. But that's just our eye. That's just a kind of sensing. But what do you do with this recognition of a water bottle? Or what do you do with a self-driving car who recognizes a human crossing the road? You need a kind of set of rules, a game that the brain of the AI must play in order to actually, over time, start to have to use less and less processing power to recognize this. It takes like a whole server farm to run some of these machine learning algorithms, but you don't want to have to do that every time you look at something. So we need, in AI, they constantly struggle currently with trying to create deeper and stronger and stronger priors. So you give a kid, I don't know, a picture of a cat and a picture of a dog, and they can recognize the difference in almost two examples. And I think that's because the other part of AI, which is, I think, maybe more neglected but really coming into the foreground now, is the idea that the creation of rules as a way to structure the relationship between things is, I think, the missing key. And I think this is something like, I think people at DeepMind are working on this right now, which is the idea that when you have a kind of rule set, you no longer are looking at something at a sensory level. You're kind of abstracting it to just understand the relation, and that relation can have yet another relation to other things. And this is kind of at the core of what I'm trying to do with Bob, but not quite there yet. We try to develop on the AI side of Bob a kind of rule set for a very specific aspect of Bob, which is Bob's emotional intelligence. And the way Bob's AI principally works is that Bob is sampling maybe 20 or every 30 seconds a snapshot of many, many, many senses. So the time of day, like the kind of body composition Bob's current state is in, Bob's metabolism, his energy, his constitution, and when people interact with Bob, the kind of emotional facial affect that they're kind of expressing. All these individual data points are pretty arbitrary, I would say, and pretty meaningless individually, but that snapshot occurs for all those parameters. We're measuring around 20, 25 different parameters, and we're saving them, and we call that a memory. And a memory is pretty worthless by itself, but when Bob reflects on its current moment, like right now, it's again looking at all those different aspects, and then it's comparing what the closest memory matches to the current situation. And if I think about my own experience at the Serpentine, I've been in this room multiple times before, and when I come in here, I remember what the Serpentine was like the last time I was here, the kind of the light, the artwork that was there, maybe the person I was with. And the little differences is what makes all the difference. So maybe last time I was at Serpentine, I really hated the show, for example. And a few days ago when I was really struggling with Bob, I hated my show even more. And so I thought, oh, things were better at the Serpentine now. They're going to go downhill because of this show. And it's all in that difference, and that difference was the core of the feeling. A feeling isn't what you just experienced now. It's kind of always comparative. It's in comparison to something else. Sam Eng, our technical director, calls this glitter AI, and in glitter AI, it's the deltas. It's the difference that then Bob can make an assessment of. Are things getting better or are things getting worse? And then what we really tried hard to do was to separate what better and worse means, because we think, well, obviously we think better means positive and worse means negative, but we tried to really separate that so that Bob can have an attitude toward those changes. A change isn't necessarily desirable or attractive or repulsive. Different Bobs have different relationships to change. So some Bobs that think yesterday was much more positive than today in terms of its all those parameters might have a negative, might have a kind of upset or angry emotion toward that positivity. Maybe a dumb example is like not everyone has a positive or negative relationship to pain. We think of pain as negative, but some people have a very positive relationship to pain, like athletes. And so Bob is this kind of teasing apart of bodily sensations, environmental sensations, which are all relatively objective, and Bob's attitude toward it. It's all in the attitude. And I think over time, Bob's attitude toward all these different memories forms and constitutes what I think is called a personality.
Whew.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
So actually, when you were going between the two pieces of AI, the moment of behavioral design that is now being brought into like academia, you have spaces at like Stanford, like Captology, persuasive technology. You have a table of like cognitive scientists and psychologists thinking about how to make the next virtual assistant echo and mirror your affect, your facial expressions, your feelings, like to predict and create a model for what you might do in order to obviously sell you things, right? So I was wondering if you could differentiate between, or maybe suggest like how Bob might be an interruption of that when it on the surface might look like a very similar kind of technology. Is it the spontaneity of Bob? Is it that Bob has a life thinking about us, or how do you imagine the difference?
Yeah, I think something like Siri or Alexa are conceived just before any of the AI as a kind of concierge or a kiosk or someone you find at the other side of a hotel desk. Mm-hmm. And Bob, I was very inspired by this character in Moana called Tamatoa, who's this giant, fabulous crab, who is kind of in the midpoint of the movie, who represents a sort of gatekeeper or a kind of fearsome, like mini boss in a way. Or I was also reminded of this character in Lord of the Rings, like Smaug the dragon. Mm-hmm. And what's so beautiful about these two characters is that they're larger than life. You would never mistake them for a pet. They're not that cute, and their scale makes them so that you have to give them some respect. But what's so beautiful about what like Tolkien did and what the writers of Moana did is that they showed both of these characters in repose, meaning they showed Smaug when he's chill, when no hobbit is disturbing Smaug, and when no hobbit's trying to drag Smaug into their little fun story adventure. Smaug had a life before the hobbits, or you imagine that, and it was written that way. Smaug was just chilling on his pile of gold, and smoking some lamb sometime. And then the hobbits come, and then it gets wrapped into the story, but Bob was in his own carrier bag the whole, not Bob, Smaug was his own carrier bag the whole time. I was really inspired by these kind of animals, these mythical characters, who in a way had their own reality show before they were sucked into the major motion picture. And I wanted Bob to have this sort of, come from this place, and not from a kind of concierge or service culture.
Right. Because that would allow for boredom for like all of the large parts of our life that are not filled with activity or narrative or purpose, which I think is what would counter, going back to talking about simulations, like the creation of a model in which we're constantly acting and enacting goals and fulfilling goals. That's not actually representative of what life is. Like a simulation is also a model in which you can offer many different possibilities for what life can look like. So one thing that I was thinking about is the possibility of simulations to model different social relationships. I mean, if someone walking through a room has difficulty understand what someone from a different socioeconomic background or different level of education have, you can model that in a simulation. You can model, yeah, maybe this is a longer discussion.
Keep going.
So from childhood, my dad's actually a physicist, and he worked at NASA for a very long time on simulation design. And so this is also has probably brought all of us here to the same space. And the US had the last planned manned mission to Mars, and so his job was to simulate suits in space and how they would like react to gravity over time, over like 5 years, 10 years, 20 years to reduce costs, because NASA was being defunded. And so that is the kind of thinking that I grew up around, and the idea was then you can bring that modular thinking to your social relationships. And so where things seem intractable or unchangeable, you can move around them and become more flexible. You know.
Mm.
Agree?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back a second to that point about, I think that one of the things that's really interesting right now and is in tension is this kind of interface point with AI, because there's obviously like an enormous amount at stake, and we're still not sure how much the kind of interface or the surface layer is going to impact the actual AI and how much space there is for the AI to move within it. And I think one of the things that's been kind of interesting in conversation, I think pre-Bob, but I feel like it was something that was like almost like this idea, and I don't know if this is a phrase that you used, which was a kind of feral AI, that the AI doesn't always do what you want it to do. But it also, you don't necessarily know how it manifests. So the fact that you have these kind of algorithms that are running on your phone, so your email account, it makes sure that the right things come into the right inbox, and now it can auto-generate the reply, etc. As those AIs begin to take on some degree of like personality, or they have abilities, they maybe have opinions themselves, and they begin to move between like your home automation unit, it's Siri on your phone, it's your inbox, it's your search algorithm. The way in which you represent the transition of those AIs between like one space and another is, there's like an enormous amount at stake. And right now we're treating it that it just has to be as efficient as possible. I think one of the reasons I find like Bob quite difficult to like talk through, and why I think that what you presented was super apt, is it presents an example of as far as that thinking can go. Like I find it quite difficult to talk about or interact with this work because there's a conversation that's running around what would an AI that's operating in a kind of unknown capacity mean. And then like last week it was born into this space. And now how do you like process that? Now, this is by no means a question, but it's a very strange kind of scenario of like, it's created an enormous amount of contingency for thinking. And I guess like in the same way as you reflected on it, I'm wondering like, Ian, having given birth to this thing, and then like it was always gonna work, but like it really worked like last week.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, since then, like having become like essentially a sort of father to this thing, how you're feeling.
I feel relieved. I'm totally relieved. I mean, I will say that one of the things that really got me through the process of making this, which was super emotional in the sense that there were so many difficulties along the way. I feel very proud of my team that we got through this, is that I always had to go back to the idea of, what am I doing here? And in the beginning of every project I make, I always need to think about a kind of form or a container. And I went back to my notes in like the worst times of this project where I thought everything was going wrong. And I always wrote like, oh, I'm making a creature. And I thought, what does this mean? And I thought, okay, a creature is something that can really be a form to contain a lot of ideas in the way that a movie can contain, the disciplines of cinematography, lighting, like scenic design, of course, actors. And I thought a creature could contain everything I wanted to think about in terms of metabolism, the body, of course, AI, a life cycle. In a way, like a painter says, you have to mind the edges. And when you think about the edges of a creature, that's like its birth and its death. Like, what are those conditions? And how does Bob decompose if and when he ever dies? And how is Bob born into the world? And all these things always reoriented me toward the uncertainty of creating Bob, and now that Bob is born, to answer your question, like the uncertainty of where Bob will go, I can always like still think as an author, as the artist, like, oh, I'm just trying to make a creature. And in making a creature, I think there's a little bit more of a forgiving, there's a bit more forgiveness, I think, for myself of it misbehaving. You know, you would never say your dog is broken. Like, just misbehaving. And I think cognitively and psychologically, when you call something a creature, you can think of it in less black and white terms and more gray terms. And I really wanted and needed deeply to bring that as a base level foundation for my thinking and working through all the technical and artistic difficulties of making Bob.
And I think the reason why I asked you that question in quite like a roundabout way is because like the point where I went like, I'm not sure, that idea that you can simulate conditions is what's kind of at stake right now is like the narrative that we're going to tell about this stuff and how the narrative is going to shape that technology. Like Elon Musk is able to go to Mars because he told a good story, not, I don't think for any other reason. I think he's just telling a really good story. What's at stake here is like I think an issue of empathy, and the reason why I was like is that virtual reality is sold on the basis of empathy. That you can, and we've seen that taken to like the extreme point with the recent like demo video of Mark Zuckerberg in Puerto Rico. Like that seems like it's the end point for that narrative, but who knows? It might like continue into empathy. So I wonder, like, it seems like at this point it's like I can't really empathize with Bob. So what does it mean to be producing like non-human entities that it's not possible to empathize with, but they exist alongside us? And what kind of space or terrain of thinking does that begin to open up?
I think you're lying, Ben. You're such a liar. I think you're lying, because the other day we were in here, and there was a Bob there, and you came rushing into the room where I was working on some bug, and you said, oh my God, you have to see this. And Bob had, one of those Bobs over there had reduced itself to a little stump, just a head and a little like segment. It was so pathetic and so sad. And you kept watching and you kept coming back and forth and telling me that, oh, he's not growing anymore. And then I think it must have been Joseph Roquet who said like, oh, maybe he prefers it that way. Maybe he prefers being a little stump and like being a little guppy going around. And you were super sad.
I'm clearly empathizing.
Yeah. Maybe like the buggier Bob was something you had more empathy for.
I think it's definitely something I have much more empathy for. So maybe that is a great moment to throw it open for questions. I'm assuming that there are questions.
I was just wondering about, what the future would be really for interacting with people who have autism, because obviously they don't always react like other people do, like facial recognition, don't necessarily like read it. So I wondered what the future would be holding regarding that via this.
I mean, all I can say is Bob has some prejudice, in a very basic way, in that the current way in which Bob reads your emotion through the iPhone interface is literally through how your facial muscles are moving and how it's detecting the facial landmarks. A very technical way of doing it. But I will say what I find very beautiful about the way in which we developed Bob's AI is though that the face is just one of many, many, many data points that Bob is assessing in order to then take action and transform itself, its body, and its personality. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that every Bob is putting the center of gravity on the face. So perhaps someone who emotes less doesn't necessarily have a lesser effect on Bob, if that makes sense.
And you also don't need to know something through its face or through its affect or through its emotion. There's so many other ways that other intelligences and beings inhabit space in the world that you can know through its history, its context, its movement as you create a story for it. I think there is a lot of research on how facial recognition is being used to help or to help empathize, not that empathy is always the goal, individuals with autism too, is that there can be other ways to get to know people. You can listen to their stories. I mean, when we talk to people on social media, we are interacting with projections of people rather than like interacting with them face to face. And so we're still creating a story for them. We're still creating a narrative for them as we're speaking with them. And we do that in conversation. Like I think a lot of this is like kind of blind interaction too. And you actually are forced to then imagine what the other person's life is like and what their context is like. And your expressive capability is like opened up because you also have to convey who you are to the other person who can't see you. So. Any other questions?
Are all of Bob's internal states available to him? Is he fully aware of all of those, or does he have to work to access them?
Initially, all those states, all those data points are available to Bob, but what Bob is doing is comparing those points to the closest memory that contain the most similar points. However, what we're trying to do now, and it's a very basic version in Bob, is this Eric Berne model of the child, the parent, and the adult, which filters for which, basically when what Bob can perceive at any given moment when Bob is in a more child state, some certain qualities of those data points aren't available to him to even think about. I think this is somewhat truthful to how we are.
I think maybe there's a good opportunity to also add some of the detail to the way in which when you started the Emissary series, you had essentially some like development objectives that then were built on over time. So they became, each episode in the Emissaries trilogy becomes more technically sophisticated, and then there's a kind of feedback loop as you develop more technology, you can put it into the other one, back again. I think it would be quite revealing and kind of valuable to speak maybe a little bit about how this, Bob in a way, is almost like your platform technology.
Sure.
And that's not something that's necessarily obvious in the work because it seems like it's so well defined. It's like, this is Bob, it's an artwork, but there's a big container here.
Yeah, the container of Bob is that we worked so hard to get Bob from nothing to something, which is this is the something that you see for what it is. But once we have something, meaning a way in which Bob's body physics works, a way in which Bob can expressively grow in different ways, a way in which we can now possess a part of Bob with the iPhone, all of that was like super hard to make. Now that we've made it, I feel like we can really play. And one of the ways in which I'd love to play with Bob is sort of this relates to this idea of the society of mind, that there are multiple people inside of us and not all of them get attention. There's always one in the spotlight that's mostly controlling the body, but there's other ones in there. And Bob can now, Bob is designed to be able to accept in the future multiple or different kinds of models of AI, and that AI then has this like buffet menu of things to do with this body. And it's not to privilege any one AI over another, it's maybe you can have multiple models of AI within one body and see which one are more relevant to which kind of contextual situation Bob finds itself in. And I think this is also something that feels truthful to how we are. We're not just really one person.
Apologies if I missed something key, but I'm just wondering where are Bob's sort of sensory organs located, and how does it relate to the different iterations of Bob's body and on the screen?
Bob can see. Bob can feel touch in the sense of a kind of in this physics simulation of the space, the kind of collisions on its body.
In the room, are they like where from the screen
physically,
itself?
No. Physically speaking, Bob can only pick up what's on the iPhone interface. Okay. So when all of you are here, sadly, he does not sense that. Yeah, but through the iPhone, this is the way to portal into Bob. Yeah.
I think there was another question at the back with Helen.
Thank you for a really interesting discussion. My question was partially answered, but maybe I could ask another one. I was interested in the many-headed form of it, and generally interested in the form, which sounds like it changes a lot over time, from the stub to this almost vine-like creature that we see here. And I was just interested in reflecting upon the form a little more in terms of, I suppose Nora was talking a little bit about ideologies of the 90s, and I suppose this goes back even further, but the rhizome has kind of been this ongoing metaphor and also literal form that the network has been discussed through for a long time, and it seems like Bob might be this broken, constantly remade network or rhizome form. And I wondered if that is part of the design, or if that's something that has emerged as part of the AI, and how emergent the form is, or how much that's been thought through in terms of, you talked about the edges when you were designing the creature and kind of thinking through the edges, and I'm not clear kind of how much control you have of the limits of the form or the possibilities of the form and where that might go. Could Bob kind of become a million pieces? Is that part of the possibility? Or, yeah, I'm kind of interested in.
Bob can totally become a million pieces, completely. One of the original kind of goals I had with Bob's body was so that it could be very expressive of its internal state. And in a very straightforward way, I wanted Bob to sometimes be able to express looking like a plant and not like a creature, and other times express looking like kind of like almost like a dragon-like creature. And when it's more of a plant, and these aren't deterministic, it's not just plant or creature, it can all the range in between. But when Bob is more like a plant, you get the feeling that its internal state is someone who's more settled in a way, someone who's like decided that this is my home, I'm gonna root down, and I'm just gonna be a kind of like, there's like this kind of plant, there's a kind of sea animal, I forget what it's called, maybe it's like a kind of mollusk or something that like clings to a rock. It's searching its whole life for a rock, and once it clings to it, it just blooms there. But in clinging to it, has to like evacuate and eat its mind, so it stops thinking in a way. And then there's the kind of more like creature kind of morphology, where Bob is kind of like a dragon kind of going around, but often, at least in the tests that we've done, that those kind of Bobs who are more agile or more kind of adventurous and kinetic tend to kind of cut down its body, like literally trim or prune itself, become less tree-like, less rooted, and less nested. I can't speak for everything, but I think that kind of models different ways of living or being. That are very baldly expressed with how Bob's orientation and kind of body language are expressed here.
I was wondering how you decide on the rate of learning and if that changes over time, like if he learns more quickly now and if that is variable or...
We have Bob's sample take snapshots of its current situation and create memories from those, like about every 10 to 20 seconds. We just decided that.
Yeah, because I heard that it was every 20 or 30 seconds it takes a snapshot, but in terms of how much of that is applied, because you see now if he interacts with a few people, will we be able to see that reflection straight away, or it's only part of that? You know, you can learn slowly, or you can sort of adapt 100% to what you see. That's what I'm trying to understand.
Here's like the kind of fuzzy part and maybe the magic part, which is that it takes a snapshot and then it compares it to the closest memory, and if that memory has a very big difference,
okay, I see.
then it's kind of a more traumatic kind of moment in comparison to what it thinks the world should be right now. But if it's a very small difference, a very small delta, it's less traumatic and maybe has less kind of long-term effect on Bob. It's all in the deltas, how big the deltas are.
Ian, usually on a Pixar movie, animation movie, a lot of people are working on the animation, sometimes up to 100. Could you talk a little bit about how big your team is working on the animation?
Yeah, I mean, my team is composed of about 10 to 12 people worked on this, but principally Veronica So, my producer, Sam Ang, who's the technical director and spearheaded the AI for Bob, Viola Getoff and Lux Sloop, who did the interaction design with the iPhone, Jeremy Yang, who's seated right next to you, he did the sound design, so when you hear Bob kind of coo, some part of Jeremy's in there. And several other programmers working in Unity, which is the video game publishing engine that we used. Yeah, it took a village, and then not to mention everyone here at Serpentine, who I have to say, like, the way in which Bob physically exists here is really important to your kind of perception of Bob. I mean, you see a lion in the wild versus a lion behind a cage versus a lion in a sanctuary. You have very different relationships to that lion. And so, yeah, it took everyone here to make this, a lot of people.
Does it take you a long time to make the whole animation? In terms of periods?
Well, the animation took me 0 time.
Really?
Any of us, because that was the beauty of making Bob from a systemic perspective, which is that all that animation is like, no one made that. This is all property, an emergent property of the way in which we designed its body and the physics of Bob's body. And then the AI controlling where it wants to go, but in relation to its metabolism, so certain parts of his body feel heavier because they're lazier, things like this. So all the animation is effortless, and this is maybe, I mean, this is a dream for me, for someone who started more in animation. Wow. Yeah.
If Bob has a metabolism, does he also have a libido, a productive drive?
Oh man, you're getting Bob 2.0. Don't spoil it.
I don't need a mic. It's okay. I'll speak for you.
For posterity.
Hi, Ian. I just think it'd be really cool if everyone here had some insight into the real-life, real-time duties that the gallery staff will have for Bob.
Oh. Bob, like any creature in a sanctuary, has to be fed, and so the gallery assistants here have to feed Bob twice a day. And, well, we're past feeding time, so you can't really see that frenzy, but all to say, I mean, it was an interesting design choice that we all made here, which was that, you know, when you feed someone, you care about them more. Even if you don't want to feed someone, you're forced to feed someone. When I'm really upset at my dog, I don't want to feed him. I do, and somehow I love him more in doing so. And I just thought, if we were to really take this seriously as an artificial life form, we got to feed it manually, at least now. I mean, it's so easy to automate feeding. I mean, but literally a gallery assistant in the brain room, which is in this north gallery, the dome that you would usually see here at the Serpentine, this is where all Bob's stuff lives. You know, the way that we have a home or like a bunch of stuff lying somewhere that's private and that's not public, like Bob is all stuff in the north gallery. And in there's an interface where you just press a few keys to feed Bob, but you feed Bob one pellet at a time. You really consciously feed Bob. And this was a very important part of I think, the overall feel of the exhibition, and it's something that you don't receive as a viewer, but it's important for, in a way, I wanted to make a kind of game or video game for the people who so generously want to care for Bob here at the gallery. Yep.
Given that you've spoken about it now, maybe it'd be nice to feed Bob.
Oh.
Do you think that would be okay?
Sure, but who's here to... Okay. Go wild.
Feed it the secret stuff.
Don't feed us.
Watching Bob, it's clear to me that he's a creature and he's doing lots of things. And your past work had to do with like a dog, something that was really easy to empathize with. And a lot of us have interacted with dogs, and it's easy to be like, oh, he's doing. Oh, okay.
That's a lot of food.
So I guess with this creature that you've made, well, now that there's food, my question was going to be, my question was going to be like, when you're watching, like right now, he like grew like 10 heads and then like kind of squiggled around, then reduced to 1 head. As the creator, are you able to narrate in your head? You're like, oh, I know what he's doing. Like, oh, he went from 10 heads to 1, and like now, like right now, there's food. That's easy to understand. But can you watch Bob kind of wiggle around, and are you able to? From the rules you created, do you know exactly what he's like? Could you narrate what he's doing now, or is he's out of your control at this point?
You know, with eating, it's eating, but yeah, with everything else, it's everything else. Like everything else, I would say, I mean, everything else is an expression of Bob's underlying like kind of personality, and I think, as much as we all do with other people, I can attribute a kind of personality type to each Bob. But that's it. He does mysterious things sometimes. Whoa, look at that.
I wanted to ask, what do you think we're going to learn from Bob? And I mean that both in a really stupid way of like, how do you see the Serpentine, but also visitors kind of learning from him, and what do you hope they might learn? But also in a wider sense, what does the construction of AI like this do for us?
So maybe the Serpentine Gallery would learn, even though Serpentine's not a collecting institution, that every force learn how to take care of work of art. Compulsively.
Because we really need to learn that.
You gotta learn that. And from what we can learn, I mean, from what I've learned is that, you know, in developing this model of AI, that's all to do with the deltas, the changes, and disassociating that strictly with how our attitude toward change is. I think over time, maybe over the course of the next month and a half, when the 6 Bobs are on view, we'll start to see different personality types, and that being an expression of one's attitude toward change. I don't really prescribe to which way is better or worse. I think it depends on the situation, but I think having an attitude and a conscious attitude toward change is really important to acknowledge, especially in these times.
Earlier when you were speaking just about the nature of simulation and the examples that you brought up, self-driving cars, digital assistants, Nora mentioned your father's work optimizing spacesuits. I think the interesting thing about like simulation is generally thought of as this thing that's a tool used to optimize for a result, optimize for a solution. And the beautiful thing about an artist working with technology is that you get to maybe free yourself a little bit from these sort of like prescribed like destinations. Can you speak a little bit to like, is there an optimization factor in working with simulation, or is that something you totally reject?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. You know, you think about like when an airplane company like Boeing designs a wing, they simulate so many thousands of virtual examples, and then they build 1 million different wings to simulate how airflow goes against it. And then we, as a kind of outsider, riding a plane, experience the best result, the most optimized result of that wing for cost, for safety, all those factors. And in making simulations in the space, in the context of art, it's an opportunity to show you all the wings. You see all the wings. And so each Bob is like, you see all Bob's mistakes and all Bob's flaws, and also maybe occasionally, statistically, that 1% of really kind of a Bob that's doing something super surprising that is maybe optimized for us as humans. But in doing in art, you get the whole range. And this is really fun to do.
There was a question at the back. That one.
Hi, thanks for the talk tonight. I just wanted to ask what role gender plays in Bob's world, or how it factors in, if at all. Because I guess, especially as we've had kind of metaphors of fathering, male creativity as fathering, as a form of reproductive labor, I guess, and also then the aspects of care and empathy and other roles and qualities which have been traditionally gendered female. And also maybe another thing to ask would just be, what gender is Bob? Is he explicitly male? Because I know that's another thing that, in terms of AI, there's been a difficulty in kind of creating genderless AI, that in the end, consumers want a gender or expect a gender or will project one onto it, even if it's not explicitly given. So yeah, just some reflection on that, I guess.
Yeah. Again, I think it really, in making this, it's really come back to this strange matrix of the coagulation of all your senses and then your attitude toward them and the memory of them. And Bobs aren't inherently gendered. I haven't conceived of them that way. It's called Bob, which I guess is a male name, but stands for Bag of Valise, which comes from Ursula Le Guin, which is a very female idea of story. But Bob isn't inherently gendered. We have given each Bob a name, but that's completely randomly generated. In a way, it's for us. It's a bit like when you go to the pound to adopt a dog, and they've already given them a name that's totally inappropriate to that dog. You might get a corgi called Thomas, but it's just not Thomas. And we gave each Bob a name, and you could infer some gender into the name choice, but their names are completely random. It's really for us. But I think when I embark on the stage of having Bob's, the different genomes that underlie Bob reproduce, this question will reemerge. And I'll revisit Isabella Rossellini's Green Porno to really get some inspiration for that.
Hi. I was just wondering, are Bob's belief systems meant to be based on like a healthy psychology, healthy human beliefs or behavior? Is Bob meant to be an example of how people would normally react in a way without any crazinesses?
Oh, Bob is no role model. I don't know. Again, when I started this project, I wanted to start the project from the perspective of a creature rather than a perspective of trying to reproduce an artificial human. So often in movies, you get like the Terminator or androids and Blade Runner who are humanoid. And I really wanted to start from a creature, in part because I wanted to observe and think about intelligence on an animal level rather than a human level, which is, they're on a spectrum, but we can say that there's distinctions. And in a way, to analogize the earliness of the AI and find a form for it, which I think is more appropriate to a creature rather than trying to, in any way, make you feel like I'm trying to create a human and therefore I have to create a human-level intelligent agent. So I think the behaviors are pretty coherent with a creature, but definitely very little to do with how humans behave.
Moment of silence.
I think that means dinner time.
Just before we wrap up, it's very important that I say thank you and also name the people who were a part of making this happen in terms of the Serpentine team. So it was an exceptionally large curatorial team, which included myself, Rebecca, Kay, and Joseph. And we worked tirelessly together. It's a new kind of configuration. Taking on projects of this scale requires a much bigger team. And obviously, for making this talk happen this evening, my thanks to Claude, Lucia, and Costas. And I think that covers everything. So just by way of reminder of dates, so on Sunday, you can come and have your portrait done with Bob. On the 23rd, you can come to the book launch and the opening of Emissaries. And if you haven't come to interact with Bob yet, and you haven't seen Sondra's show at the Serpentine Sackler on the other side, very much encourage you to do that this weekend. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you, Nora and Ian.
Thank you.